Welcome to Vicki Brosniak on our latest issue of My Jewish Story. Vicki is a longtime member of Temple Beth Miriam and a longtime member of the Long Branch community, and can be found from Memorial Day to Labor Day on some beach somewhere. And that's pretty much a guarantee. So, Vicki, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
And yeah, and I am going to have a very open-ended question, and you go with it wherever you want. Tell us your Jewish story.
Okay, well, I'll go back to the beginning, but first I have to comment on what you just said. We have been members of Beth Miriam for 50 plus years.
50
I,
plus years.
I was the youngest married person, not a child of a former member, at the time that we joined in 1970. 1970. Okay, so then going back to the beginning, how did I get there and why? And why, if I stayed for 50 years and plan on staying another, I don't know, 50, but you know.
Okay. Well, great. If you
Right.
if you're our first 100-year member,
Yes, you get free.
we'll have a special oneg.
Awesome. And I hope I'll have teeth to chew the food.
We'll grind it up for you.
But back to the beginning. I was born in Mount Airy, North Carolina. The only other people that were ever born there were Andy Griffith.
Are you're from Mount Airy?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Sarah and I took a trip and we found ourselves in Mount Airy, North Carolina. And it was on the day that Andy Griffith died and everybody was sitting Shiva.
Oh my gosh.
I never knew anybody else from Mount Airy.
And they were also, who else was from Mount Airy?
Who?
Chang and Ang, the original Siamese twins. But that's just for your,
That I didn't know. Yeah, yes. But you know the statue of Andy, and right? So they were putting flowers there, and they were sitting there davening mincha and sitting shiva. And Sarah and I are looking at each other like, what happened here?
Well, the last Jewish event before that was my birth.
I thought it was his birth.
Right. In 1945, my father was a little busy in the United States Army. He was in Okinawa at the time, which probably wasn't a great place to be in 1945. And my mother went to stay with her sister and brother-in-law who lived in Mount Airy. Why? Because my Uncle Henry, my uncle by marriage, had been born there to original German Jewish farmers that came way before the turn of the 20th century to Mount Airy. And when he found my Aunt Molly, who was born and raised in Newark, New Jersey, they were pen pals. They got married and lived in Mount Airy. So my mom was a little tired of waiting for me at home in Newark, New Jersey. So she decided to go to Mount Airy to wait for the birth of me. And my Uncle Henry was so excited because had I been a boy, he would have had to have driven to Charlotte, North Carolina to get the mohel.
Yeah.
So he was very happy. And after I was born, he got to go to the temple in Greensboro, which is still there. I've been there like 50 years after that day. And went and he had me named in that temple. So that's the beginning of my Jewish story. Simultaneously, my maternal grandfather was naming me in an Orthodox shul in Newark. That was my mother's father, because that was their belief. And when you had a baby, in those days, they didn't even bring the baby to temple to be named. He was naming me on the first Shabbos after my birth in Mount Airy. So we stayed in Mount Airy 6 weeks and then came home up north.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so you weren't raised in Mount Airy?
No, 6 weeks. I hardly have an accent. Yes.
Yeah, you hardly have an accent.
So then we came north, but because my grandmother didn't like my mother staying with a new baby in North Carolina, she didn't really trust things going on in North Carolina. And we weren't even in Mount Airy in the town. We were up 7 miles in a section called Piney Ridge, which still doesn't have numbers on the houses. We were there maybe 20 years ago checking it out. But then we came home to Newark, New Jersey, but we had a train crash on the way outside of Washington, D.C. My grandmother, my mother, my cousin Cindy, who my grandmother had brought for the ride, she was 10 years old at the time, and we were all in a train accident when I rolled out of the basket that they had me sleeping in and underneath the train. And that's about the last really exciting thing that happened in my life. But we survived. We all survived the train accident, then come home to Newark. So Jewishly speaking, here were my maternal grandparents, very old world, they weren't recent immigrants, but they were immigrants. My grandfather went to the little Orthodox shul in Newark that I don't have any memory of attending. But my paternal grandparents also lived in Newark at that time, even though they had been in Texas most of their married life, and they were members of B'nai Jeshurun, so which was the big Reform temple there. It still is a big Reform temple. It just moved up the hill into Short Hills, but it was the same congregation. My great grandfather and my great grandfather were both founders of that temple pre-Civil War. I want to say 1848, I think, is the date on the building. And my earliest Jewish memories were of family things at home, but also being very committed to my Jewish education in that temple, which I loved. And even though we had at the end of my stay there in the 60s, my confirmation year, we used to count the mice who ran across the sanctuary as we were practicing for confirmation. The building was in some state of decay. It was an old building.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, but my memories were very positive. Friday night dinners in the basement. There was this kind of scary basement, but they fit in hundreds of families. We were very active. As a matter of fact, when they decided to build the new temple in Short Hills, my mother had been in the cast of a fundraiser, was a Saturday night dinner dance. And we had a lot of people who worked in New York in the television industry. They were writers, they were comedy people, very creative people. And they wrote an original musical, something about Indians and Jews. I can't remember exactly, but the plot basically, and this was a high drama. This was Saturday night on the stage in the old sanctuary in the old social hall in Newark, Getz Hall. And the premise of the plot was that a Jewish girl falls in love with an Indian boy. And of course, it's a very big shanda. But then as the plot evolves, they find out it's okay because he's really Jewish. So in order to have this done productively, everybody in the temple with a Cadillac had to, and there were lots of those big Cadillacs in the 50s with the big tail.
Yeah, sure.
So you had to meet on Sunday morning, and they did a wagon train thing where they drove up South Orange Avenue from Newark all the way up to Short Hills. They went into the woods and they photographed the circling the wagons. It was part of the plot of the story of how the Jewish princess was going to fall in love with the Indian.
I would love to get a copy of
that. And I'm sure it exists somewhere in their archives.
Oh.
And it was quite a classic. My mother played the mother of the young Indian Jewish princess girl. And all the kids were invited for the dress rehearsal. We're not for the formal dinner dance, but they made enough money from that to make a big impact into the building of the new congregation. By the time that happened, I was already away at college and then got married. So we never really belonged to B'nai Jeshurun anymore after they moved to Short Hills. I've been to the building since, mostly driving my kids to youth group events and things like that. But that was my original roots and my original Jewish tie. One year, I think I was in second grade, my parents decided maybe we should see what's going on in the conservative congregation in Union, where we lived, because it would be the kids that I went to school with, and it would be geographically easier. They had to drive down Route 22, that horrible section
Terrible.
of right outside of Newark Airport.
Terrible.
3 days a week. My brother and I were never on the same Hebrew school schedule. So 3-4 days a week, they were riding down that strip from Union to Newark to educate us, plus Friday night services and sometimes Saturday. So we spent a lot of time on Route 22. So we joined the temple in Union. I forget its name, Beth somebody or other. And my parents were very unhappy. I was very unhappy. It was totally oppositional to the beginnings of my education. And even my more traditional so-called Orthodox grandparents were really getting into what was going on in Reform Judaism and how impactful it was on our lives and how flexible and how positive it was. I have a vivid memory of my confirmation, my Orthodox grandfather sitting there and getting totally involved. The sanctuary was filled with roses. It was June. There was no air conditioning. It was hot as anything. And just getting into the very warm atmosphere of our temple. We had two rabbis, Rabbi Eli Pilchik of blessed memory. I still have all the volumes of his books, and Rabbi Barry Green, he was the young rabbi.
Yeah.
He came the year that I was confirmed.
And I think he's retired now.
I think he's retired now. Yes. So there's a bunch of rabbis there now. And it's nice to see through the Camp Harlem things. I've been connected in some ways off and on to people B'nai Jeshurun my whole life. So
Sure.
Then when I got married at the ripe old age of just 21, I wasn't even finished with college. I married the lifeguard and we moved to Bradley Beach. We had only about maybe 2 years of not being affiliated with a temple. And even though I was commuting to college to graduate from Bradley Beach to Union, substitute teaching on my days off, and when we certainly had a social life, I missed the connection. I saw an ad in the Asbury Park Press that the temple in Matawan was looking for Hebrew school teachers. But I knew there was a closer temple. We had been at Beth Miriam for something or other, but I don't even remember what. Pre-Rabbi Goldman, Rabbi Lefkowitz was still the rabbi. So this is before 1969. We were married in 66. And I knew that eventually this would be the place we would connect. But I was drawn by the thought that, well, maybe I'll teach religious school. Maybe that'll be something I'll do. So played around with that thought. And I had my son in 1970, stayed home about 10 minutes and decided I needed something. And maybe this was the time to connect. I didn't want to go back to teaching full time. And Norm was very supportive of that. But I called Beth Miriam and I got Hannah Buckman on the phone.
Hannah Buckman of blessed memory.
Right. And Hannah was Hannah. And anybody that knew Hannah, I mean, there's never been another person. She took over everything. And I asked to speak with the rabbi. Rabbi Goldman was new-ish. She was only there a few months. And she said, well, I can fit you in for a slot for 15 minutes. Tell me what your interest is. I said, I saw that Temple Shalom, I think it was, had an ad for religious school teachers. I know that we will affiliate with Beth Miriam at some point, maybe if not now, next year, whatever. But that's where I would like to teach. So I went in for my first interview, which the 15 minutes, I think, turned into about 2.5 hours.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
And when I left, Rabbi Goldman had said, and what does your husband do? I said, well, he's in education also, but you'll never get him involved because he grew up in an Orthodox shul in Newark, New Jersey. where they dragged him in, forced him to memorize a couple things for his bar mitzvah. He did what he had to do. He left, and he hasn't been in the temple since. And he was sweating when he had to go meet my rabbi before we got married. He was a wreck, and it's never going to happen. So we all know that didn't work out.
Yeah.
The way I thought it would, because Norman came in, fell in love with everything and all the goings on and the new curriculum that was being put in place for religious school. So he ended up teaching, and I ended up teaching for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think I took off the year that Dana was born, and then I went right back. And I loved it, and I loved the kids. And those kids are in their 60s now.
Right.
They have gray hair. I don't. And it was, to say the least, a very successful endeavor. We joined the temple almost immediately thereafter. And so that was 1970 that we joined the temple. And that, of course, has been my closest affiliation to anything Jewish.
Right.
Then along the line, a few years later, I started teaching at Hillel Yeshiva, Orthodox Yeshiva, and I was asked, would you like to enroll your children? My children were in 3rd grade and kindergarten at the time, but I like to enroll my children at Hillel Yeshiva for free. And I remember meeting with the Rabbi Adlin, David Adlin, and he offered me, he thought that he was giving me this wonderful gift. And I said, thank you so much for your offer. But that would really go against the way my husband and I are raising our children. It just wouldn't work out for us. And he said, why not? And I tried to explain respectfully. Turns out that he was raised in a conservative congregation in Philadelphia, had a very similar kind of background to mine, but he found this new way of Black hat Judaism, and he just thought everybody would jump on the wagon. I declined, and my kids continued to go to Beth Miriam Religious School and learned everything they needed to know about that. But on the positive end, even though I always had Beth Miriam to go to, and that's where my observances were always around, it was nice to have that little bit of the orthodoxy. I could take in as much as I wished. I could reject as much as I wished, which was most of it, and still have that connection. I did love leaving school on Friday afternoons, going to the bus with the Shabbos music playing in the background and kids leaving with a howl under their arm. There was
nice,
a very nice, warm and fuzzy Jewish feeling, and that was part of my life there. And after having been there, I was there 41 and a half years when I left there a year and a half, 2 years ago, a year and a half. I made a lot of very important friends and associations, and of course, ex-students and who I run into. So that was a positive part of being Jewish also.
So a lot of people who are looking at this video on YouTube from around the country are not going to know a lot about the Jersey Shore. So it bears repeating that we have a very large Syrian community, Syrian Jews. We have a large Reform community. There's a very large conservative synagogue. There are several yeshivas. Hillel Yeshiva is, I think it's the biggest one around.
Yes.
And when we say yeshiva, we're not thinking of young men sitting there studying all day. It's a school.
No, it's a modern Orthodox.
It's
yeshiva.
a modern Orthodox school. And Stella taught there too. And our kids went there for 2 years.
We have a very unique situation here. When we were first married, the Syrian community only lived in Bradley Beach.
Right.
And they had come, I don't know how they found it, but it was pre-war when the first people came. And I knew them from 1966. So when I started in 1979 at Hillel, I had some familiar friends even with the Syrian Jewish community. They're a very unique community, and they have definitely flavored the town that we live in. Right now on my street, there are 4 houses owned by the same man who is renting to young couples enticing them to come from Brooklyn. I mean,
Mm.
the enticement was unnecessary after COVID. The entire borough of Brooklyn moved here.
Right. Yeah.
And,
Sure.
but it's a very vibrant community.
It is. It is.
There's
And it's a,
negatives and positives to every community. And
Mhm.
the enthusiasm and the large families with many more or less happy children is a very positive vibe. It was fun to teach there most of the time.
It is. And if people don't live in a large Jewish community, they might not understand all that we have here, because we could literally go around the corner and get whatever we need, and the kosher bakeries will fight for your business to sell you $1.95 challah. Uh, but a lot of places don't have that, so that's why I wanted to clarify that.
Yes.
You were uh, you were active at Beth Miriam. What are the kind of things that you it might be easier to ask what you didn't do at Beth Miriam, uh, but
Well, I
really, what
served on the
what
board, I think around 25 years.
I think that's probably about right.
Something like that. I have a plaque somewhere. It's here. I think that was 25 years. I love that. Um, Teaching religious school was my favorite encounter ever. And of course, being on committees, probably my most favorite was the Rabbinical Search Committee. That was so much fun.
That was a
It really
2-year
was.
process. I'm glad it
We,
was. I'm glad it was fun for you. Hey, listen,
right.
I visited a bunch of other congregations. I'm still waiting to hear from one of them whether or not I got the job.
Well, we spent a year and a
They
half.
never got back to me.
Yeah, no, we did a year and a half.
Right.
And one of our most fun activities was stretching out a piece of brown paper, like brown paper bag, wrapping paper kind of stuff.
Butcher paper.
Butcher, right, with magic markers and drawing the perfect rabbi.
Nah.
You probably never heard about that. We drew the perfect rabbi, and it's so funny because we were something like 22 people. We were a big committee for that task.
I remember.
Everybody had their own idea of what the perfect rabbi would have. And the pictures that we ended up with, I mean, besides being hysterically funny, it was amazing because we could analyze how demanding Jews are. We want what we want. We wanted the perfect person. We came pretty close.
I came pretty close. Okay, I'm glad.
And
I'm still on probation, though, right?
yeah, right.
25 years next year.
No, your gray hair keeps you here. You have, at this point in time. But I mean, watching my children grow through the religious school and through temple activities was a highlight of my life.
Sure.
I was lucky enough to have my parents be temple members from the time they moved here in 1976, and they became very active immediately. And that was a wonderful thing to have. So we really have enjoyed so many things. And now, of course, having my grandchildren there is the icing on the cake.
Of course.
We still have one to go with a bat mitzvah. And if life ever gets back to normal and they can actually be there in person, it'll be even more fun. But
the good thing is that they will be able to be there in person. But we're all going to be 37 feet apart. But
it's okay. We can do it.
But you know what? We can do it. We've been doing bar mitzvahs.
But I know I've been very fortunate because my nearest and dearest friends are all members of Temple. Yeah. We've done heartbreaking things together, and we have done very soul enriching things together. And I think back to things like our Soviet settlement committee of bringing in families. Someone has a picture of me with my head under a sink at Middlebrook Apartments. I was scrubbing. I didn't like the way they cleaned the apartments for our new people coming from Russia. So I got stuck like under the sink scrubbing out. And people, I remember Hazel Scott donating these beautiful chairs that we had to go to her house and bring the chairs. And the minute this Russian lady named Nina saw them, she knew they were good chairs. And she said, "Oh, thank you. You've made me feel so much at home." And she, in her limited English, and she sat in her chair. And the day we put the mezuzahs up in their apartments and we all cried,
Yeah.
it was a complete Jewish experience.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a great Beth Miriam story too.
It was fun.
You had said something interesting that I just want to pick on. You were pick up on, not pick on. You know what I meant. You've been at the temple for so long, and I think it's true that only if you're in a community for an extended period of time do you not just shape the community and are shaped by the community, but that you actually experience all that all that life has to offer. I mean, we have done in 25 years since I've been here, and you've been here literally twice that long. You know, how many weddings have we done, and namings and bar mitzvahs, just of your family and of the group that we all hung out with on the beach. But how many how many funerals have we done? And the tapestry that we have of life in a synagogue, maybe it's true that it can only be knitted together as a tapestry if we're there long enough to knit it. And if we're not
Truly.
there long enough to knit it, we go there, our kids want to be bar mitzvahed, they're 11 years old, but we give them a bar mitzvah, gesundheit, hey, goodbye. And there's no real connection. That doesn't happen very often, I'm happy to say. But the idea that you would not just immerse yourself in the congregation, but knit yourself to the congregation, not just be a name on a list in a congregation, but be such an active member. I think that
it's funny you should say that, because something comes up. My father, unfortunately, had a stroke early on at about 56 years old. And after that, he was never really 100% himself. But when they moved here in 1976, because my father was really forced to retire, they threw themselves into temple activity. Their parents had done that. My Elsa's grandparents had done that. That's the way it was. I mean, we have things in our boxes, and we moved a year and a half ago. I first was reacquainted with things I saw maybe for the first time, even from Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, where my father was raised, from the temple in Atlanta, where my grandfather, his father, was raised, and subsequently moved from Atlanta to Dallas. When you were in the South, apparently, and it was a Jewish community, and you sure knew this from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, you have to stay together. You have to support one another.
And that's something that you don't have to do at the shore.
Truly. We have so many, when you, with the challah, when you can go to 12 places on a Friday and buy a challah, something gets lost with the immediacy of having to accomplish that challah. It becomes a task.
We don't usually think of a large Jewish community having any disadvantages, but there is a disadvantage.
Yes.
And that disadvantage is something that you picked on, because 50 years ago, 75 years ago, Atlanta was not a big Jewish community.
No.
Dallas was more so, but here there have been Jews since really before the Titanic.
Right.
And I say the Titanic because we had members of our temple.
Yeah.
Well, we have members of our congregation who died on the Titanic.
Right.
Which is kind of an interesting little piece of Beth Miriam history. But you've seen a lot, and you've seen the community grow and actually evolve. What are the biggest changes? What are the biggest changes that you've seen?
Wow, that's a good one. Well, of course, the faces change, and
sure.
And of course, we miss the old faces, the people who have passed on. But it is always exciting to come in and like at Friday night services and see somebody that you knew that was there 50 years ago. Better than that is the children and the grandchildren of the people that were there 50 years ago, and they're still there.
Yeah.
And when somebody befriends me on Facebook, for instance, that was sitting in my 6th grade religious school class as a 11-year-old and is now seeking
65.
grandmotherhood,
Right.
and contacts me to be my friend, that's awesome, because that's a constant. Families that have been there for a long time and their children are there, and even on the high holidays when the kids that have moved to New York or away or something come home, that's a wonderful feeling. I see happily a new increased sense of commitment that I think has, it wanes, it ebbs, it flows, things change, but just watching the couple of these interviews in particular, it's so nice to see the enthusiasm and the joy, and can't wait to get back in person. I mean, I love Purim, and this was the first Purim I haven't been in Beth Miriam for 50 years.
It's so true. We were saying the same thing.
Hard, yes. So I love that when you say how much it's changed, sometimes the people have changed. The ideas are very, very much the same. We want the same thing for our children, for our grandchildren, as our ancestors wanted for us. And there's something wonderful about being in a country, and on one half of my family side for hundreds of years, and yet the commitment and the practices and all that is very much the same. So Beth Miriam has changed, and yet it hasn't in the important things. I think we've grown, we've had backslides, we've had advancements. I'm very encouraged about the enthusiasm of the young ones. There's some great talent and some wonderful brains out there, and seemingly very, very committed. So
they are.
So looking forward to seeing it all in person again, as I'm sure you are too.
I think so. One of the advantages of being forced to stay at home, which is where we've been all year, basically. I mean, I go into the temple, and as soon as somebody else comes in, I put on a mask and run out the other way. But I mean, but there's reasons to be, there's reasons to be overly cautious. One of the advantages is that all of us have forced us to be more creative. And these interviews, I'm not even sure where I got the idea from, so I'm just going to give Stella the credit.
You might as well.
I might as well, since she thinks of everything else. But we had this idea and say, how easy is it to reach out to people and to invite people to do this? And I got to tell you, to listen to their stories is remarkable. You got people who were born Jewish, and they lived in Brooklyn, and the only big decision they had to worry about is which pastrami sandwich to get on Sunday from which deli. And then you have people who came from Russia, people who escaped the Holocaust. These are all interviews that are all up there, and it's amazing the diversity of our congregation, but also the respect and honor we have for each other in the congregation, which I think is really great. The one thing I like about Beth Miriam, I think, more than anything else, is the absence of cliques. There aren't a lot of cliques at the temple, which I found very refreshing.
And an overlapping of age groups.
I mean, I'm thinking, how many people were at Milt Zimmett's funeral, right? I mean, here was a guy who was he 90?
99.
No, I don't think he was quite that. I think he was 94 or 96.
Oh, okay.
I don't think he was I don't think he was 99. Not that when you get that old, it really makes much of a difference to add another year. But
I remember Clara G's 100th birthday party. You made reference to the fact that he was married to an older woman.
He was married to an older woman. But I use that as as a touchstone, because how many people were there and how many emails and phone calls did I get over the course of the couple of days before his funeral from his former students,
Oh, for
and
sure.
from all over the country. And when he would get up on the bima on Yom Kippur to read a Tem Nitzavim, you are here standing today with your children and your grandchildren and all that
I
with
can
his
hear his voice. Yes, yes,
exactly,
yes,
exactly.
yes.
And here we have somebody of that generation, somebody of your generation, somebody of my generation, and somebody of my children's generation, who are all anchored, to the people and the events at the temple. I mean, that's really remarkable, and I think that's really what makes a congregation a congregation. It's not
Absolutely.
it's not a building; it's the people.
Flashing back to a half hour ago or so, when I was talking about my first entering the congregation, and Norman immediately was on board and started teaching, it was Joe Goldman, a man whose last name was Garton, but his son is a rabbi.
His son was my rabbi in Toronto. He was my youth group director, Steve.
Steve, right? Steve was a youth group kid at the time,
Yeah.
and Norm and the Garton father and Milton and Joe did this. What did they call it? The conference plan. It was something that came out of a project that Rabbi Goldman had worked on in Denver by Audrey Friedman Marcus, and they put it together where it was a themed weekend, and they start out the first weekend at camp, and that was an intense. Well, you look around the world, places like Monmouth Cardiology with Jeffrey Daniels, he was one of those kids, and is still there. I mean, that is rewarding. It reminds me of Milton, and it reminds me of Milton's input. And to be able to have that kind of life-affirming positivity on the lives of so many generations of children.
That continues to go on.
Absolutely.
When we walk into the religious school, even though the religious school got renovated, I mean, there's still echoes of all of the people who were there.
Yes.
I mean, you can hear them. The first time I went into this story. The first time I went into the Beth Miriam religious school, it was my interview weekend, and I walked downstairs. You remember what it looked like downstairs?
Yes.
And with the tubes and the pipes and like a fault. And I said to Richie,
it was haunted, I think. Yeah.
No, it wasn't haunted. But I will tell you a funny story. I said to Rich, I blurted it out loud. I said, "It looks like a Turkish prison down here," and it did. So it's funny that you say haunted and mention Hannah Buckman, because several years ago, we had, after Frank retired, we had a young man who was working for us. He was our maintenance person, and it was late in the afternoon, and he had taken a nap downstairs, in the youth lounge, no big deal. And he came up and he looked terrified, and I said. And I said, I swear this is true. I said, what's the matter? I mean, what happened? He said, there was a woman in the youth lounge, and she woke me up and she started talking to me, and she said her name is Hannah.
Oh, no.
And he comes running upstairs, and he says, you have a ghost. And I said, well, I might not have a ghost, but you certainly do.
Frank used to talk to her in the kitchen.
Frank talked to her in the kitchen. She has never appeared to me, thank goodness, because I would give her an application form. But she apparently, she still roams the halls of Beth Miriam.
That's it does not surprise me. Yes.
But
ask your temple expert on such things, Dr. Frank Esposito. He'll tell you. He talks to dead people.
Right. Well, right. But taking that kind of funny story, a little creepy, but also extending the metaphor, I think there's a lot of living ghosts at the temple. There are people who are living even though they've been long gone, and their
Yep,
influence is still there. And
absolutely.
that whole community that's been created exists still, and we're just building on it.
Right.
That's great.
There's no doubt.
What other final thoughts can you share with us before we wrap this interview up?
Well, number one, I thank you, and I think this is a fabulous idea. I'm doing the same thing with your interviews as I'm doing with Netflix. Like, I don't want to blow it all at one time. I have to like portion it out. I'll do one interview and then enjoy it for what it is. So these have been terrific. Is there going to be something where they're going to be put together as a something? Is there a way to do that?
I am just a country rabbi, and I'm not.
No, you're not. You're
I'm not.
a high-tech country rabbi.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not a film editor. So if somebody wants to do all that work, that would be
that would
fine.
be awesome. I can just imagine some confirmation class or something or your high school kids examining this and taking it apart.
You know what? It's a great idea. Holy Blossom Temple where I grew up was celebrating its 160th anniversary, and they were making a film, just kind of like we're doing now. And this was when my dad was getting sick, just before he passed away, and they called me. And they said, would you be interested in being interviewed for the film for the 160th anniversary of Holy Blossom? I think it was 160 years. And I said, well, why me? And they said, well, we were all sitting around at the board meeting discussing who to interview, and all sorts of names came up, and your name came up. And I said, why? They said, well, you're the only person we know of that got expelled from Holy Blossom Religious School that became a rabbi.
I love that.
So I was in that movie the same way, and my dad didn't get to see it because he had passed away before it was actually presented, which is really too bad. But it was these little video chapters really tell a story.
They do, and it made me think, from the time that you and I discussed you doing, interviewing me, my whole life flashed in front of me. All these pieces of what makes me who I am today, and what makes a temple what it is the thousands of people that have been members, and it's really a great venture. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I thank you for inviting me on board, and I hope that it continues.
Well, I'm going to keep reaching out to people, and
good.
As long as people say yes, I can keep doing it, because it doesn't, it's so much fun.
And thank you for walking me through the baby steps of the technology to get me on the screen. I'm still amazed that I'm here.
Yeah. Listen, I have to record it.
I have your camera.
And you have my camera. And by the way, I'm going to ask Norm. I'm going to do the same thing with Norm. I'm going to reach out to Norm and do an interview with him. But let's hope everything recorded. It's going to be up on YouTube in just a few minutes. So let me just put this on stop for now.